Welcome to 1014 here at 1014 Fifth Avenue. My name is Benjamin Bergner. I am the program officer at 1014, which is the organization that runs this beautiful space. This building has a long history. If you're interested in it, we do have a bit of an exhibition downstairs. You can also go to 1014pastandfuture.org and you can find out about the history and about the future of this space. I just want to say that this will eventually be turned into a fellowship program with 6 apartments on top, and these beautiful spaces are going to stay more or less the same, at least the footprint, so it will continue to be a public space for events, bringing people together from both sides of the Atlantic. It's owned by Germany that bought it in 1960. They still own it and let us use it for projects like this, and we're really grateful about that. I'm also very grateful, not only to welcome you, but to be able to collaborate with the Vitra Design Museum for the second year in a row. Last year, for New York City by Design, the festival, we featured a talk about an ongoing exhibition, or an exhibition that was then showing at the Vitra Design Museum in Weil am Rhein about plastics. Some of you might have been here for that. And this time, we are really happy and honored to be able to welcome Iwan Baan, who will show his work, or there will be a first big retrospective about his work at the Vitra Design Museum later this year. So if you ever happen to be in the southwest of Germany or close to Basel, make sure to visit the Vitra campus and to also visit the Vitra Design Museum there. It's quite an architectural gem. I do want to thank my team, without whom this whole event and our program would not be possible. That's Katja, Cassidy, and Jack, and it's Jack's last day today, so I do want to say a particular thank you and all the best to him. Thanks to Vitra, to NYC by Design for this collaboration, and without further ado, I'd like to hand it over to Mea Hoffmann, curator at the Vitra Design Museum and our host of this conversation this evening. Give her a hand of applause.
Thank you so much, Benjamin, and warm welcome to all of you. Yeah, and a big thanks to 1014 for hosting us tonight. We're absolutely thrilled to be here tonight, and I'm very happy to be here with you, Iwan. Before we dive in and see some of your fantastic images, I'd like to briefly introduce you, although you probably don't need much of an introduction. Most of you might know him, or if you're not familiar with Iwan Baan as a name, you've definitely encountered his photos. So maybe just to start briefly, you're born and raised in the Netherlands. You studied at the Royal Academy of Art in The Hague, and actually began your career in documentary photography, and then kind of transitioned to the architectural photography by chance, but more on that later. In 2010, you were the first to receive the Julius Schulman Award for Photography. And you're actually known to travel light. You only work with a handheld digital camera. I'm sure you also tell us a little bit more about that later. Without a tripod, oftentimes shooting from a helicopter. That will explain some of the aerial views you will see later that you're also very well known for. Your images document the growth of global megacities, but also portray iconic buildings by some of the most well-known architects of today, to name a few, such as Herzog and de Meuron, Rem Koolhaas, and Zaha Hadid, but many more. And you're particularly known for your human-centered approach to architectural photography, as you depict architecture, not as an abstract ideal or as an idealized object, but really as a backdrop to everyday life, and a stage for life and the encounter with the built environment. The exhibition we are currently working on is really a kind of first overview exhibition of the last 20 years of your work. You've done many shows and many books over the last years, but most of them were focused on particular projects or themes. And so we are quite ambitious in tackling the many thousands images you've taken over the years and narrowing them down at the moment. So that's very exciting. Yeah, maybe today we will dive into some of these main themes that we're exploring that kind of kept reappearing throughout your career and are of particular interest to you. And as Benjamin already mentioned, the exhibition will open in October this year and will be on display in Germany at the Vitra Design Museum until next March. So please feel free to come visit us or to maybe see it in another venue throughout the international tour afterwards. But yeah, without further ado, I'd like to hand over to you. And instead of me explaining what you're doing, I'd love to see some of your photos.
Thank you so much, Mea. And thanks for being here. I want to show you a little bit what we're working on for the show. Let me go and stand up. Can we dim the light a little bit? And I can show some images. Yeah, so I studied in art school photography. For the first years, I wasn't very not completely sure sort of what direction I was going into. I did a lot of documentary photography, and then it was in 2004, 2005, kind of by accident that I met Rem Koolhaas, fellow Dutchman, and it was a very interesting moment there in the office. There were a lot of projects going on, a number of projects which were just finished, like the Casa de Musica, the Seattle Public Library, a number of these large projects. And Rem asked me to go there and photograph. He saw something in my images. I had no idea really about architecture so much, but I saw, yeah, what could be possible there, and especially this was one of the first trips I did with Rem to the construction site of CCTV. At that time, one of the largest office buildings in the world, which was being constructed. So I proposed him to start documenting that over the next 3-4 years when that building was going to be finished. In the end, it took a little longer, that was a first sort of reason for me to go to China a lot and see what was happening there in Beijing. This was like 2005 to 2008, kind of the whole run up to the Olympic Games, like a city which was like in this massive change. These buildings all coming up mainly by migrant workers who were living there on site. They were like kind of small villages for these migrant workers being built like next to these large construction sites. Like the CCTV at times had 10,000 construction workers there on site. And I was fascinated by both what was being built there, but also like that city in this massive change. These people living there on site, people coming from the countryside often, which have hardly seen a building taller than maybe 2 or 3 stories, and building these kind of mega structures. And a kind of architecture, like for me it really informed my practice and like what I wanted to document there. A kind of architecture which you feel from the very beginning, like it's all structure basically being built, being exposed, and coming together. So like it's the sort of architecture you see from a very early stage on. And of course China was like in this massive change. Like I was traveling around there a lot. You see these cities being built from scratch in the middle of nowhere. Like a whole sort of lifestyle change for a lot of people there in the country. So there was a lot happening there in the country. This was this architecture park which was being built there, where 12 architects were doing these kind of follies. Was organized by Ai Weiwei, and it was in Jinhua, a bit outside Shanghai. And there's then a developer who builds like all these high rises in the back and wants to have a nice public park in the front. So Weiwei had invited a number of architects, Herzog and de Meuron, Kristen Gantenbein, Fernando Romero, Tatjana Bilbao, Michael Maltzen, and Wang Shu. So a lot of architects which were not very known at that time. A kind of younger generation, and they were able to build these structures, and that's, yeah, there were a lot of connections kind of happened out of that first collaboration there in China, both between the architects and also like, yeah, what informed me and architects I started working with. And yeah, there was a time for a lot of experimentation there in the country. And then, yeah, there's these big Chinese openings with lots of confetti, red banners, and speeches, and everything. So, at the same time, I started also documenting the Olympic Stadium via Weiwei. I got in touch with Jacques and Pierre, and yeah, again, like these large structures coming up in the back of that kind of everyday life of people, yeah, having their watching their TV, having their lunches, their dinners, everything on site. It's like a kind of mini city which was built in these places, and at the same time, yeah, these structures coming up there. So I went back and forth a lot around that time. And through that, a lot of the connections in the architecture field were starting for me. And again, here with the Olympic Stadium, it was also like, it's all structure, it's all bones basically, which slowly become, architecture and being inhabited by people until, yeah, here, like with the opening of the Olympic Games. Another one of those projects around that time was in Ordos, where Weiwei and Herzog and de Meuron were asked to design a large site with 100 villas. They invited about 100 architects, all young architects, to design these villas. So there were these meetings there in the middle of nowhere in Ordos, in the desert, where all these architects came together in the middle of the desert, taking side pictures, being inspired by the context. There was very little there, but for architects, a really great sort of a start to do things, and in the end nothing was built, but a lot of connections with that younger generation. So Fujimoto, for instance, here, like who had little built at the time, a lot of things started around the time. So from there, yeah, I started working with more and more architects, and for me, it was always important. Like it's like I know little about architecture itself, so for me there should be another story also around these buildings. Like it's not just a building, but you try to show it in the context of the city. Why is that building there and not somewhere else? So for me, like sort of stepping back from that building and from the details and showing it in the context, showing these larger aerial views is always an important part of the story, the visual story I try to tell. The Elbphilharmonie, also Herzog and de Meuron. And I started working a lot with Japanese architects, Toyo Ito here, for instance. And then both, it's often you're hired like for the sort of final image once a building is complete. But for some of these larger projects, it's fascinating to see also like how they're being built and how these cities around it are being changed. For instance, here in the Taichung Opera House from Toyo Ito, these massive concrete shells which were being built in Taiwan. And one of these projects, which I felt like looked almost better during construction and the kind of rawness of the place. And once it's finished, sometimes things look a little bit too clean and too polished in a way. And kind of these juxtapositions of like these cities rising with this sort of endless generic things, and then these architects working on really special forward-looking places. Su Fujimoto in Japan, also like these juxtapositions of like almost impossible houses he did there in that urban context. Or Zaha Hadid, with whom I worked quite a bit when she was still alive. And for instance, yeah, here the Maxi Museum in Rome, I was commissioned to photograph, and you come there, you see the place, like it looks all, yeah, quite spectacular, the building. But when I was there, like I told her, like, yeah, we should get that aerial shot, because I felt that was really a way to show the project. And the PR department of the office said, "No, it's too expensive. We won't do these kind of things." In the end, like, you feel like you have to get that shot. So I rented the helicopter anyway, and then you get that shot where, yeah, it actually really explains the building, like how it sits there, the shape of the river, the context, this kind of industrial part of Rome, and how all these things together. Like, for me, that was important to show, and in the end, that becomes kind of also an iconic image which goes around the world and explains the project. Or here in Azerbaijan, and then, yes, stepping back, and you see that city, Baku, an oil city which developed over the last 150 years during kind of all the oil booms and crises. And yeah, that juxtaposition of that architecture and that urban environment. Here for REM in 2008, I photographed like the models and so for the competition of the Taipei Performing Arts Center. And then you follow that project throughout its building, where it's this massive sort of steel and concrete web, until a couple months ago, when I finally made it out there to Taipei and the building is finished. And it's these completely abstract forms sitting in that urban landscape. And you try to work with any kind of condition. Like, I'm traveling so much, and sometimes in such a tight schedule, like the weather doesn't matter me too much. I feel like great architecture, it looks great under any kind of condition. And here, like, it's in the pouring rain, the sort of wet surfaces, the woman with her umbrella walking around. That gives also like a feeling of that moment. And it's not only that sort of idealized image which you try to capture, but also like the kind of raw and everyday life in these places, and how they're taken over, how people become part of that, and how structure plays a role in those lives. And yeah, like these buildings where it's so much about that structure, which really creates the kind of leftover spaces in the building, which really creates that environment. I find that always fascinating. This is a building probably with like 150 different materials, all used kind of in different ways and very unexpected ways, which is totally fascinating to photograph. Or here we're in Hong Kong, the M+ Museum for Herzog and de Meuron, which was also recently finished. This massive horizontal slab with that vertical slab with the offices in there, but then it's also like a kind of an opposite building, like OMA's Taipei Performing Arts Center. Like here, that's maybe 2 or 3 different materials. Like it's that concrete, it's those glazed tiles on the outside, and then kind of incredible spaces which go a number of floors down into the earth, all kind of informed and shaped by the underground tunnels between Hong Kong Island and Kowloon. And then these kind of massive open art spaces created kind of by that leftover space. And here you see it like further in the context of the city at night. That whole facade becomes a giant LED screen at night. And like with all these kind of buildings screaming for attention, that vignette of that big LED screen on that prominent location really stands out. So yeah, it's sometimes these large projects for which you're hired, and sometimes it's the tiny ones where you sort of have to travel for days to get there. This was like in the very north of Kenya. One of the driest regions there on the African continent, where Selgas Cano, a Spanish architecture firm, husband and wife, José Selgas and Lucia Cano, who do really incredible work and with whom I've been collaborating for a long time. They had this question from a friend of theirs who was working with a mission to build a tiny vaccination and doctors outpost, basically in the middle of nowhere, place where there's basically no building around. So they went with their students from MIT and built this small canopy and building there in a time of 2 months, with the most basic materials, but creating a kind of extraordinary space there. Just scaffolding pipes, corrugated steel, rocks found there in the landscape, and some concrete cylinder blocks. And then this was the inauguration of the building with all the locals being there around. And sometimes these kind of projects inform and start other projects again. Like I was around the same time, they're working on another project in Kibera, one of the largest slums there in Africa, and it's this endless roof of corrugated steel, small buildings. There was a small school there. Also, like all these informal neighborhoods, self-built, corrugated steel, the most basic materials, some wood and so on. That school had burned down. And around that same time, the Louisiana Museum in Denmark, a kind of total other place, was working on a large Africa show. So they saw the pictures of that, of the pavilion there in Africa, and they said, oh, let's rebuild that pavilion in Louisiana for the exhibition, out there in that kind of beautiful landscape. And we thought, like, let's do something else and make a building kind of inspired by the same ideas, but for that little school there in Kibera, which had burned down, and built it first in the gardens of the Louisiana Museum as a sort of prototype, but it's also all built with the most basic scaffolding materials, corrugated steel and translucent materials. Have it there for a couple months during the opening of the exhibition, and afterwards pack it up, bring it to Kibera, and build it there actually really as a school there. So after the exhibition closed, they packed everything up, and it actually fitted perfectly there in that neighborhood. And it's now about 7-8 years ago that it was transported there. I went back actually a couple months ago, and it's still like a place fully in use. It's like with the most basic materials. It's very simple built, but also like a way that the users there can easily repair it, fix it, build out of it, and it's a kind of basic framework which could be used and abused over time. And this was around the opening, and now 7-8 years later, that's still fully in use for about 150 kids who get classes in these tiny classrooms. It has 8 small classrooms next and on top of each other, but a super playful, simple structure. So these kind of places, like how these buildings are taken over, how they're used sometimes also in different ways, and so that's for me always important to show. and that aerial shot, like I feel like that tells a lot about how these cities are being built, how projects get a place in there, and you see like these kind of also that evolution of places very much like Mexico City here versus Kyoto, which is like in a way feels kind of similar, although it's in a very different stage of its progress, of course. But Kyoto also this endless pixelation of the plots of the buildings and so on. But then there's these few large, massive, the gardens, the imperial gardens, the royal gardens, still sitting in there. Or Dubai, in the middle of the desert, with the tallest building in the world sitting there in the middle. But it's just that small strip of high rises, which you really see from afar, kind of also the absurdity of that place. Chicago. So yeah, for a lot of these projects, that's sort of zooming in and out, showing that project in the context, that it's not a kind of isolated building. For me, that's important. And Sao Paulo with the Copan building there in the middle, Oscar Niemeyer. But it's like these cities all, in the end, kind of have very particular textures, I feel like, which come out in these larger overviews. Or Miami, like sitting literally inches above the sea level, and with all the buildings coming up there. And this is a series I'm working currently on Houston and its infrastructure, the highways, the oil industry, and so, and this sort of endless carpet of car and infrastructure in these places. Tokyo with its waterways being transformed to roads, and that sort of very organic way of these cities, how they grow. And then sometimes these juxtapositions here. Toyo Ito, who asked me to photograph this theater he did, this black building, kind of tent-like structure in the middle of Tokyo. And when I was there also, like, I felt that was such a contrast with the rest of the city, where Tokyo, everything is light gray, light beige, a very sort of light city with that enormous pixelation, and then you have that large, almost kind of tent-like structure in the middle of it. So again, like from above, from the air, you really see that that difference between the building and its surroundings. Los Angeles with this sort of endless grid, and when Michael Maltzen asked me to photograph his inner city's arts campus, I felt also like on the ground, like this juxtaposition of this beautiful, white, crisp, sharp little campus there in downtown LA, between all the dark and black warehouses. So from above, that really set it into its place. New York City, I flew many times over the years over, and that keeps changing, that skyline, and that's amazing always to see. And then sometimes you're there, and something very unexpected happened, like when the storm Sandy hit New York, and the city was out of electricity for 6 days. And on the second day, like, I was walking around, I had just arrived here for another job, and it's difficult to really capture that moment, like how do you show a city without electricity, without light, as a photographer, where that light is so important, of course. But again, like showing it from the air really showed that large difference between the part of the city with electricity and without. And it became, that kind of iconic image for a New York magazine, which went the world around. But showing these places, like how they're really changed and used and abused over time. That's something which I keep going back to. Like for architects, you're hired usually like when a building is brand new, the landscape has hardly grown in, the dust is still on the floors. But seeing a place like 50, 60 years after its completion is fascinating. So these were images I did for this book, where we looked at the two cities, Brasilia and Chandigarh, 50, 60 years after their completion, and where architecture, it's really becoming the backdrop of this everyday life, and people there, they take the buildings, the architecture for granted, but it creates this backdrop for what's happening there. Also sometimes in the pouring rain. Or the book I did with Manuel Hertz on African modernism, where we visited 5 countries in Africa, which were all in a very particular moment in time, where they became independent, and as part of their independence was like in the same time, like after Brasilia and Chandigarh, as a kind of nation building, they hired at the time mainly foreign architects to build their parliament buildings, universities, schools, and a lot of public buildings there. And it was for a lot of architects at the time, really a moment where they could do a lot of experimentation with minimal materials, create very interesting spaces. This is Lagos, which we documented now for a new edition of African Modernism, which is coming out next year. And also like, how these cities are grown over time. Architecture, it's still there, and these architects' ideas, but also like they're completely used and taken over in very different ways. And here also like the incredible colorful and richness of that everyday life and the people, how they're dressed, and like the buildings are almost mimic that kind of life as often. And I'm always fascinated there in these places, like how modern architecture plays a role there, but also like how traditions are part of that. So a lot of my projects, out of my own interest, like whenever I'm in these places, you try to visit also like the traditional building techniques in these places and how people used to build there, with just the materials which are found there in place. And that's, you see really kind of unique examples of also the necessity of what's really there, what can you build with, how can you create a kind of unique space without ordering your materials from a catalog being shipped and like nowadays from the factories all over China or from wherever the materials come, but like really like that material which comes right out of the ground there, and what you can use in many different ways. This is a series I did 2 years ago. It was a trip. I asked Francis Kerik to come with me to the south of Burkina Faso, visit 3 particular places. This is Tjebele, a village which is nowadays also on the UNESCO World Heritage List, but it's like this kind of architecture which is created from the most basic materials. It's just the earth, earth blocks, mud architecture, and then people have to refinish that every year at after the rainy season, where a new layer of mud comes over it, and they create these beautiful drawings all over the buildings. So again, like a place where almost like their outfits, their the people, the buildings, everything kind of becomes one, and something very particular for that place. And it's what fascinates me, like why is a building in that place? What makes it so special in that kind of environment? And especially with the building, the traditional building techniques, you see like these places, how a style becomes so personal and so local, and you go to another place like 50 miles away and it's something totally different, but people have been doing and refining these techniques over centuries often. Here it was also like a way they created these buildings as a way to protect their villages. Like the openings of these houses are like this high. People have to kind of crawl in, enter almost pitch black space, where only the light is basically coming through that door opening and kind of projects an image like a camera obscura on the other side of the wall. So you see kind of when people walk by on the outside, on the other side, you see the kind of shadows projected on the wall. So see if people would come towards you. If they don't belong there, they crawl in and they got a smack on their head probably and go out again. But that was a way, also to protect their places. Once you're inside, like the first 5 minutes, you don't see anything basically, and slowly, like your eyes start to adapt to the place, and you start to see the contours of these interior spaces. So the book, so these images became part of a book I did with Francis, which came out last year, Momentum of Light, where we really looked at these stark differences of these outdoor spaces. You're there in sub-Saharan Africa with like a sun which hits 90 degrees during the day and is extremely bright outdoors, and then these interior spaces which are almost pitch black and which are created as a way to keep the heat out. They're comfortable places with its thick mud walls, it's this stark difference of these interior and exterior places. And we visited also Francis' birth village, went around there. Here we are in Ethiopia, Lalibela, which always fascinated me. So I finally made it out there a number of years ago during Ethiopian Christmas. And it's this place where there's about a dozen churches, but they're carved out into the rock vertically down. And it's kind of this architecture by subtraction, like there's nothing built up, but it was this high stone plateau where people 1,000 years ago started to carve out these structures vertically down into the space. And it's kind of incredible architecture by subtraction, instead of building up something, having that idea of carving out spaces and create through that a kind of incredible space, half underground, where only the light hits during certain times of the day. Even there, like you see all kind of architectural details, like these rows of columns, not really to hold up anything, but really to create a kind of special and sacred space. Or this this church which is carved out into the earth, but then there's another space carved out another 20 meters down with nothingness, but just as an idea to create a kind of spectacular space underground. And it's a kind of architecture which could survive a constantly changing climate, like Ethiopia, which went through many wars and many destruction, but this kind of space which nothing could be done really to it. So even 1,000 years later, that's still there. And a kind of opposite as this place in Japan, the Ise Shrine, And I've been working with Japanese architects for many years, and they always said you have to visit the Ise Shrine because it's a kind of golden ratio almost for Japanese architecture. So I went there, this was about 10 years ago, during the moment of the rebuilding of the Ise Shrine. And the Ise Shrine is in a kind of incredible place. It's these two hilltops in Ise, a village outside Osaka, where since the 1400s they're building and rebuilding all these temples. So there's two identical places for each structure there, next to each other, where there's a small temple in one place. After about 8 years, they start building an exact copy on the space next to it, and that takes about 12 years. And at that moment, 20 years after its first construction, there's an identical copy built next to the original one. And then there's this whole ceremony, and I was lucky to be there in 2013 when that ceremony happened, where the whole who's who of Japanese politics, manufacturers, CEOs, Japanese society, and so on comes together. And there's this special celebration where they transfer the spirits of the old to the new structures. So you see all these identical structures, a 20-year-old structure and its new cousin next to it, and then there's this kind of incredible ceremonies around it. I was the only foreigner journalist, photographer, being able to capture that moment there. And this is a kind of very different urbanism, which I was also lucky to document about 10 years ago in India, in Allahabad, in the north of India, where the Ganges River and the Jammu River come together. There's usually a large water body, lake there. And once every 12 years, they organized this humongous Hindu festival, where they built, like in the middle of that lake, during the dry season, a site the size of Manhattan comes out of the lake, and they built this temporary megacity, which sits there for about 6 weeks. And during those 6 weeks, about the estimates are 50 to 80 million people from India visit that place. So it's literally a kind of mega city, which is built purely out of bamboo sticks, ropes, threads, saris, and so on. And they really try to build, really real structures. Like they all have facades, temples, and so on, special places for worship, and thousands and thousands of tents for the people who come there to this kind of temporary megacity. And the sort of transparency, the thinness of it all, like the people are dressed in these clothes, the buildings are close, the structures are incredibly lightweight, and it's sort of very different type of urbanism which is happening in a place like that. And this was probably also the first time it was fully electrified. So the Indian government sets up like an infrastructure there of electricity, water, and sanitary. It was all fully lit up at night, huge LED screens and structures. But then at the same time, it's these sort of centuries-old traditions which are there, and people, buildings, structure, ground, everything is just this these fabrics and a kind of intangible building, people, and everything come together. So for the exhibition in Vitra, we try to show all these different parts of the built environment I'm interested in, from my commissioned work with architects, as well as these fascinations with how people build out of pure necessity, out of traditions, and so on. And I feel like in many of these different ways of building with or without architects, you feel the same kind of spirits coming through. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Iwan, for this incredible journey. You spoke a lot about your process already. Maybe we can start with the commissioned work, and I'd just be curious to hear a little bit more about, I'm sure you receive so many more requests and projects you can take on. So how do you go about selecting the projects? What type of projects do you maybe also refuse? What do these commissions look like? Like how much creative freedom do you have? How much influence do the architects have on the final result? You already shared this lovely anecdote about Saadit, so maybe you can tell us a little bit more about that process.
Yeah. I was lucky, I think, that I started in this architecture field with Rem, and like he saw something, I think, in my pictures, which architecture photography often lacks. Maybe it's often so purely focused on the building and its architectural details and so on, and me being not really informed on architecture so much, but like fascinated also like with that story around it. Like I was able to, with Rem, it was working like you were sent somewhere and figure it out, and I did in all these places. So that's basically still how I work with most architects. I'm fortunate to be able to pick out interesting projects. And for me, what I was showing earlier is that it's not just architecture, but like it's structure. You try to tell a story on why a building is in a particular place and not somewhere else. The stories around the architecture which fascinate me, which you try to visualize in all different ways. So there should be all these other elements, not just like a beautiful design, but another visual story which I should be able to tell, which inform my decisions.
So really the particular story of the place. Are there ever, most of the places we've seen are just stunning. Are there ever projects where you're curious about something that might have failed?
Totally. I don't know. For instance, the picture of the Burj Khalifa in Dubai. Like, it's not particularly a place I enjoy, or it is a complete desert place. Often a large part of the year, not very inhabitable place in terms of its temperature, its outdoors, and so on. But then, that need to build these massive structures there. There's also this story of that juxtaposition, and a kind of thing which I'm not really purely showing out of my fascination for that place. It's not a particular architecture which I try to show, but more also that context which fascinates me.
But really kind of also documenting larger changes and shifts within society as well, totally, right? And the role architecture takes within that. I'm curious also to hear a little bit more about your perception of architectural photography at large. You've really, been very radical in how you've also redefined the field. And looking back at, some of the big icons like Ezra Stoller or Julius Schumann, and the kind of tradition in architectural photography, and also the symbiosis between architecture and photography as an essential medium of, communicating a place, to make it kind of accessible to people who can't physically access it. So I'm just curious to hear more about your take on the field today, and also what kind of social media and digital photography has done to it or influenced it.
My way of photography didn't really change when I started working with architects. Like what I showed in the beginning also, like how I worked with Rem, I could push also for some ideas and a different way of photography, and I never really looked at architecture much before I started. But for me, it was also like really an excuse. Like as a photographer, there's also sort of an endless curiosity you're trying to feed to go to these places, and architecture could fuel that curiosity for me, and to tell these stories on places, and that's why you try to get it, all these, it's constantly sort of that zooming in and zooming out you're trying to do with these, sometimes these very personal moments with people, how they react in a space. I feel like really new architecture can make people also behave differently in these places and experience a place differently, and like these kind of things you try to show also throughout the photographs. So sometimes it's like these very personal moments, what people do in this kind of new or different space. Sometimes with the older projects, how architects' ideas sometimes are used in very different ways. People occupying different parts of the buildings, modifying things to that larger zoomed out image where the building almost disappears. And I felt when I started working with architects, it was a strange revelation to me, like why architects like their renderings, their models, they're always full of people and life. But once the architectural photographer came by, it was this completely sterile kind of image, heroic image only of a building without people and so on. For me, that's sort of the grittiness and the everyday life, all the sort of unplanned things which happen in a project, and people who take that building and the built environment for granted and just go on with their everyday things. Like that's where, for me, it starts to become interesting. And
so really, the realism, the kind of lived experience,
totally.
where the building almost fades into the background.
Yeah.
It's really interesting. Just also curious to hear a little bit more about, when you travel to all of these places, how these encounters unfold, how you're being, greeted by some of the people you also photograph. Are there ever any moments where people might not like that? Or what is it like being in all these different countries and discovering these different traditions, and also, giving a kind of platform to them in a way? Like also there, like I feel working with architects or my own projects, more like in the informal cities, in the traditional places, like it's all kind of happens in a similar way. Like an architect who's excited about his last project and invites you in to show what they have created, versus someone who built out of almost nothing and found materials and so on, created a very particular, very specific place. And I think, once you express that interest in that place, in these people, in what they do there, how they created something very specific, something special. Like
people usually are like so welcoming and wants to show you also all these different, the ways they created something specific, and especially once you start talking with them, show them other examples how people do that maybe in a very different part of the world. That sort of normalcy, like people take it for granted, their kind of environment, and they can be sometimes under very dire conditions, of course, also. But people try to create an ideal environment for themselves under very different conditions. So that's coming back and forth from all these different environments is totally fascinating all the time. Yeah,
I feel like that ingenuity and diversity is really something we aim to address in the exhibition as well. Really, the kind of these incredible spectrum of ways of living.
Totally, yeah. And I feel like nowadays more and more, like there's this endless sameness of construction materials which can be shipped from anywhere in the world, and a lot of places start to look very similar. And for me, it's also something like you're often jet-lagged coming out of a plane, barely know where you are, and like that's trying to root it down and show what makes that place so different than another place, and how do you show that to others? I think that's.
Is it also important to you to preserve or document traditions that might disappear or might be threatened to disappear in a way?
Yeah, of course. There's a lot of fragility also in a lot of these places, and. Especially with this traditional building techniques, like what you see, like in with the mud buildings, like they need some maintenance. At the same time, like people can build it with their own hands without buying any materials, create a special place for themselves. But it needs maintenance, and the moment people move out, that these kind of structures fall apart. And I was last year with Anna Herringer, architects from Austria, who does incredible work in Bangladesh for the last 20-25 years, really working with the communities, building out of mud schools, communal buildings, and so on, in a part of Bangladesh where that was totally common. Like you see in a place like that, where the government a couple of years ago said like anyone who lives in a mud building is considered poor, and will give them for free concrete cylinder blocks, corrugated steel, to build a proper home. And within a couple of years you see that whole centuries of knowledge of building with materials which came right out of the ground there, disappearing, and people are almost forced to live in that concrete and that corrugated steel, and which also fails after a couple of years, and then suddenly they're forced to buy that material which is shipped from wherever. So there's also, like, you try to show to people in these places, like what that kind of ingenuity could create, and what's being lost in a lot of places.
When we're going back to the commissions, I'm curious if you, I mean, as you've told us, you're really driven by curiosity, and a lot of things fall into place, and one thing leads to the next. And I feel like your commission work oftentimes goes in hand also with your personal projects, or you're probably combining a lot of trips and travels. But you also proactively think about, you know, the kind of the platform that you have and can give to also younger architects. How do you reflect on also the voice that you have in that field?
Like, because you're traveling so much, you see a lot and you encounter a lot of people, and and you see a lot of people develop in their work. So that's definitely a large inspiration, like a younger generation to give them also the opportunity to show their work. And I'm fortunate with a lot of good commissions from large offices or clients or developers, which can offset like your own interest in like a younger generation who tries to do things differently outside the sort of common boundaries which are created, and give them a platform. So it's, whenever I see these kind of things happening, you try to incorporate it as well. Yeah.
And then I assume you also, I mean, or some of the commission work also enables you to do many of these other projects.
Totally.
So it's like
and also like with these big offices, you see lots of young architects sort of transitioning out of that, using that knowledge with their own new projects. And there's always a lot of things, which start to happen and come together after a while. Yeah.
What's currently on your agenda? Is there anything you can share, or some places that you really urgently want to travel to?
I just got back last night from the Venice Biennale, for instance. The opening is today. I didn't manage to be there really at the opening, but I saw the pre-opening.
We're very happy to have you here today.
Yeah. No, so that was really nice to see what Leslie Loco, the curator, did there. I felt it's a whole new, younger generation who was able to show things there, and a very handmade biennale with a lot of emphasis on that younger generation, on the global south, and places which needed a lot more visibility. So that what struck me very much is the lack of all the 3D printed stuff, but really going back to a lot of natural materials everywhere in the show, which was very inspiring.
Hello, Iwan. We've met several times. I'm a journalist, and so see your work constantly in magazines and whatnot. Although so much of this not. I mean, the architectural magazines don't print this kind of thing. So some of your special projects are really new to me. It's fantastic. But, when you get to, especially these places that are very hard to get to, how much time do you have to commit, or what do you have to commit so that you can really figure out what's going on? What you need to focus on?
Yeah. It depends very much on the place, of course. Like often, like I have this sort of list of places I want to visit, and you try to combine it sort of with your commissioned work, which brings you a little bit into that part of the world. Other times they're like a festival like that happens only once every 12 years, so that comes with quite some preparation and planning, and then you'll be there for a certain amount of time. Here for the festival I was for like 2 weeks documenting the place. Other times, like you're hired by an architect, it depends like on a scale of a building. You're in a place anywhere between 1 day and a couple days, and sometimes for the books you spend more times. You'll be there a week, or sometimes you come back a number of times, different times throughout the year, different events. Like you try to show a place also like under I don't try to create a kind of timeless image. Like it's always very much about a specific moment in time. Like that kind of documentary aspect of like, why is a building there? What do people there do there, and so on. Like that's very much part of it. So that informs a lot of the decisions you make, like when you want to be there and how you photograph it. So there's a wide range of.
Hi, my name is Sebastian. These structures have meaning and a story. Is there any specific one that has impacted you the most? And another question, what type of camera or equipment do you use?
Yeah. Yeah, like, I think maybe a special project which I keep referring to a lot is the Torre de Vite in Caracas. I didn't show it here in the pictures, but you can look it up online. I did a book on it and also some talks. But that was a place, Venezuela, where in Caracas, where like 70% of the population lives in informal cities, in informal housing everywhere, kind of dotted around the city. And there was this building which was started to be constructed early 80s, before the whole economy collapsed. It was just a concrete shell, basically, which sat empty then for decades. And about 15 years ago, people started to invade that concrete shell, and like there was nothing there. It was just a concrete shell, 45 stories, no elevators, no running water, no electricity. And over the years, that place, 3,000 people started to live in there, used that concrete shell literally as a sort of framework to build hundreds or thousands of small apartments in there. And that kind of ingenuity you see in a place which is incredibly complicated and difficult, but people had already a roof over themselves, and then over time could create a better and better space in there. So you saw people moving in just with a few curtains defining their space, and over the years refining that more and more with all kind of found materials. And then you step into all these different worlds of everyone who created the most exquisite, like little palaces almost inside that structure. Still, there was no elevator, no running water, but they created for every challenge, they've created a kind of solution themselves, and that kind of ingenuity out of pure necessity is totally fascinating, and I think can inform a lot of architectural decisions in many places, and is also again like so specific for that place, that location, the political conditions of that place, and so on. I think those kind of stories fascinate me a lot.
Second question was what equipment you use, I think. So basically the same as like what I've always been doing, if also from my documentary time. Like it's all handheld cameras, small. You have one small bag with a couple of the basic lenses, but you try to be a kind of fly on the wall in a lot of these places and not be too visible as a photographer, like coming in with huge equipment or assistants or so. Like it's very much on the moment and so on. So that was also for me, I think, that moment that I started with architectural photography was also a change in terms of equipment and technology. Like at that time, 2005, 2006, digital cameras became like really ubiquitous, and the quality was kind of similar as what the large format cameras were at that time, where architectural photography was so much about the large format camera, have everything perfectly in the frame and so on, and suddenly you could do these things with a small handheld camera. So it was that kind of conversions of a documentary approach towards a field which was always very static, and I think that for me, like I was at a moment in my career that I was really looking for something like how I could tell my stories, and then all these things happening in the world, in China and so on, and then being able to work with Rem on these kind of projects. Like a lot of things came there together and made that possible.
Hello, my name is Juan. Kind of related to that question, with that project in the Torre de David, do you see it as like an only project that you had the opportunity to be there at that specific set and time, or is something that you would like to go back to and see how it evolved 10 years after, 20 years after?
Yeah, no, a lot of these projects you try to go a number of times at the moment. Unfortunately, the conditions in Venezuela are really dire. So I followed that project over a couple of years from, what is it? I think the first time I went there was 2009, 2010, and the last time was 2015. So you see also a bit how that evolves, but. And yeah, like for the books, it's really interesting to see how these things evolve over time. But it happens also often that there's only one opportunity to go, and so there's the different parts.
Now that we are in the world of smartphones and digital cameras, where compared to where you started, as well as the world of Instagram and TikTok and all these different media that have really evolved in your career, how has that affected your own work?
Yeah, I admit that I use the iPhone also quite a lot in my photography, especially like on Instagram and so. Like it's mainly what you take with your iPhone also. Like I think it's really great. Like that image culture became so embedded everywhere, and everyone walks around with a camera nowadays, and it's basically also. You can take pictures with your iPhone in places, of course, which would have been much more difficult otherwise to be there with a larger camera. And I can't wait myself for the moment that the iPhone really becomes, the quality of a regular camera, and you don't have to carry all that stuff with you anymore, and have it always with you in your pocket. So I think I can only upload and push for that kind of technology and convergence.
See, two more here and then there.
I'm wondering, do you normally work as a team or just yourself? And maybe sometime do you find, because maybe this journey of photography might be a long time, or maybe lasting like 2 weeks, where you find it sometimes alone a bit?
Yeah, of course, like going to places like this, there's always a team of people you try to work with, like who knows a place like that intricately, knows an environment, a neighborhood, and can introduce you to people and so on. But that's always very specific on the place where you go, and often like these things also like happen with that information of architects you work with, like the Ise Shrine that started because all these Japanese architects I worked with always said like you have to go to the Ise Shrine because it's sort of this golden ratio of Japanese architecture in a way. And then through your my contacts with Nishizawa, who was also like involved in the Ise Shrine, like he introduced me to people and so on. Like so, a lot of these things happen also through these contacts with architects. In the end, like the photography itself, I do by myself, and like what I said before, like you work with a lightweight camera, mainly handheld. So technically, you don't need much people to be there in that place, but it's more like for that organization and getting to know people, bringing you to places and so on. That's the local knowledge there you rely on.
Hi, so my question is, what is your opinion of architects? You work with some of the biggest architects in the world, and how is it like working with them? And when you're photographing, like taking pictures of all their projects, do you sometimes see that their vision has not been achieved and they're kind of like forcing it, or what has your experience been? Yeah.
Yeah. Um, how would I say that? Architects, like they try, of course, like they try to control everything. So I think my role is very much on showing also like all the sort of unplanned things happening in all these kind of places. So yeah, what I said before also, like with commissions, like I refuse the kind of the list architects try to set up beforehand. Like I feel like they've been working with a project for like years, like for instance, REM's Taipei Performing Arts Center, that was 2008 when the competition happened, and I photographed it a few months ago when it was finally finished. So it's like 15 years, like working and reworking and so on a project, and sometimes they're so set into like specific ideas, angles, or ways to portray the building, and like me coming there. Like I'm lucky. Like I wouldn't have that patience myself to be so long invested in a project. But like coming there at the end, once it's finished and it's just taken over, and like you come sometimes from a very different environment the days before. Like it keeps you also completely open in like all the sort of particularities of a place, and like what makes that place different than something else, and like. It's for me. It's important to rediscover a place, kind of on my own. So you try to leave that baggage from the architects also a little bit behind, and really see what's happening there, and that leads you to new. Ways, I think, also of portraying that, and you come back with a lot of images, and the commissioned work. You see, of course, an architect, like what they pick and what you pick yourself sometimes is different. Luckily, I'm able to use whatever I want, like for my own stories and books and other ways to show it. And it's like an exhibition like that is also really a great opportunity to show, what I feel like really portrays a building versus what the architect or their PR agency and so on pushes.
Well, thank you so much for these wonderful questions. Thank you for being here tonight, and for your interest also in the exhibition. For those of you who will not be able to see it, we are also working on an extensive publication. Thank you, Iwan. Very excited and looking forward to the next months and the opening.
Likewise, yeah.
Thank you.
And it's nice, like, to have a place where I can bring together all these different, like, for a lot of people, it feels like they're very different worlds, but at the same time, like, you try to portray them in a similar way, and in the end, like, they're all, about how we all as humans try to create a world, very specific places for ourselves, and how to bring that all together in one exhibition. I'm really looking forward to it. Thank you.
Thank you all for coming. If you liked it, you can...